Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all the support. Alright everybody, well hey, before we begin, I just want to say Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year, all that stuff. I hope you all are having a great holiday season, and I wish the best for you and your family. And I would just like to say thank you to all the support, or for all the support that you've shown me and my channel over the past year. Seriously guys, I could not do it without the support of each and every single one of you, so thank you so much. And since it's Christmas time, I wanted to try to find a Christmas topic to cover on today's video. I thought long and hard about it, but I was trying to find a topic that would have occurred in the time period that we like to focus on this channel, like the early 1900s and the whole Titanic era. And what if I was to tell you that I discovered an event that happened in December of 1914, just a few months after World War I broke out, and honestly, I would call this event a Christmas miracle. So I thought this event would be perfect to cover on this channel for today's episode. And well, I hope you all enjoy it. All right, everybody. Well, hey, without any further ado, let's begin the tale of the Christmas Truce of World War I. In August of 1914, World War I officially broke out and quickly spread across Europe. And while the fighting was intense everywhere battles were taking place, there existed a point on the front lines where basically a stalemate was developing between the Allies and Central Powered forces. This area became known as the Western Front, seen here on this map drawn in red. Now, what happened at the Western Front was both sides were trying to keep the other side from advancing into the other's territory. So what both sides did was they began digging a series of trenches, and then once these trenches were constructed, each side would basically get soldiers placed in these trenches. And then if any soldier from the opposing side tried to cross the trench, well, you can guess what happened after that. Now, the space in between these two trenches quickly became known as No Man's Land, because if any soldier ventured into No Man's Land and tried to invade into the other's territory, they were quickly gunned down by the opposing army. Now, even though the fighting was intense along the Western Front, after both sides had dug their trenches and had soldiers placed in these trenches, a strange thing started to occur along the Western Front almost daily. Small ceasefires were breaking out quite often along the entire front line. Now, what do I mean by ceasefires? Well, these weren't ceasefires officially ordered by the government. These ceasefires occurred naturally as a result of daily life involved with trench warfare. So, in a nutshell, what these ceasefires were was both sides would basically eat their meals at the same time. So this would be an unofficial ceasefire. There would often be cases of patrols from the opposing sides running into each other while they were walking around, and these patrols would just ignore each other and keep on walking, because both sides weren't doing anything in this particular situation that would invade on the other's territory. So both sides decided to have a live and let live attitude, and they just let the other side continue on with their way. There was no need to start shooting at each other if the opposing side wasn't doing anything to invade the other's territory. Now, the earliest record of these unofficial ceasefires occurring can be traced back to November of 1914. Now, by this time, with World War I having been going on now for a few months, both sides thought the war would be over soon. So it seems like that, at least in the trenches, both sides were just trying to hold out until the war was over. This was more important to them than basically killing the opposing force. And besides, both sides knew that a new enemy was rapidly approaching, an enemy that both sides would have a very hard time in dealing with. Who was this enemy? Well, it was none other than the harsh reality of the European winter, which by November of 1914 was rapidly approaching. Now, in December of 1914, the winter had been particularly harsh on both sides fighting along the Western Front. Weeks of rain put so much water in the trenches that all the men in the trenches basically had to wade through so much mud that it became a constant battle for all these men to keep their feet dry. They had to hang up all their food up on the ceiling, because if they left their food on the ground, it would be washed away by all the water. I mean, can you just imagine how horrible that would be? And then on top of that, it was freezing cold. So you've got men huddled up in the trenches doing everything they could to keep warm. And then on top of that, you also had to deal with the constant threat of enemy forces shooting at you. I mean, honestly, I can't imagine how horrible these conditions were for both sides fighting in this war. And honestly, I'm not surprised that unofficial ceasefires became more and more common, because all these men were basically struggling just to stay alive due to the brutal weather conditions that both sides were facing. By late December 1914, Field Marshal Sir John French was getting more and more concerned about the morale of his troops along the Western Front. The low morale was due in part to the horrible weather conditions, and it was also due in part that the British soldiers thought that the war would be over by now, so they were becoming depressed that they were still fighting on the battlefield. Now, because of the low morale, Field Marshal Sir John French also noticed that the British soldiers were communicating more and more with the Germans across no man's land. How were they doing this? Well, the British and German soldiers were literally just yelling at each other across no man's land and having conversations. So, Field Marshal Sir John French ordered that no further communication with the enemy would be tolerated, and he also ordered his troops to launch an attack on the German front lines. This attack resulted in heavy British casualties, and as a result of this attack, this only served to further damage morale instead of increase morale, as Field Marshal Sir John French hoped would be a result of this attack. By now, Christmas was beginning to rapidly approach, and the commanders on both sides knew that there would be a drop in morale around this time, because this would be the soldiers' first holiday away from home. So, in order to combat this, the commanders on the front lines arranged to have Christmas delivered to the trenches, on both sides. Now, I don't mean that both side commanders were talking to each other. This was more of a case of both commanders on both sides deciding to do the same thing. So, on both sides of the battlefield, Christmas arrived at the trenches, and both governments sent all kinds of presents to their soldiers fighting along the Western Front. There was chocolate, tobacco, cigars, you name it, these soldiers got it. And both governments even arranged to let family members mail presents to the soldiers on the front lines. So think about how much of a boost in morale this was, that these soldiers were able to get something from their loved ones back home. And both governments arranged to have winter clothing brought to these soldiers. So, as you can see, this was definitely a good Christmas, or as good of a Christmas as you could get for all of these soldiers fighting through this terrible, terrible war. And then, on Christmas Eve, 1914, one final gift was delivered to all the soldiers fighting on the front lines, and I would argue this was the greatest gift of all. The rain stopped. The trenches drained of all of their water, and any water that was left over quickly froze solid, allowing a semi-solid floor to exist on the trenches. Because the weather cleared up, the soldiers were finally able to dry up and get warm thanks to all their winter clothing. Then a light snow started to fall and quickly covered no man's land. Then, with all of this, one final event would occur that would make this Christmas one of the most memorable in recorded history. So what was this event that occurred on Christmas Eve in the year 1914 all along the Western Front? Well, as the evening of Christmas Eve continued on, the sound of gunfire slowly but surely stopped all along the battlefield. Now, what caused this? Well, I think it was two factors. I think the first reason was due to the incredible change in weather. Due to this incredible change in weather, everybody's spirits were lifted and no one was in the mood to continue fighting on Christmas Eve. And the second reason, I think everybody was just feeling the Christmas spirit, you know? They received those gifts from back home and they were feeling good for the first time in weeks, and no one wanted to fight on Christmas Eve. And because of this, all the fighting slowly but surely died away, and for the first time in months, silence fell over no man's land. There were even a few points along the Western Front where the German soldiers actually began putting up small Christmas trees with tiny lanterns tied to them. They propped these up above their trenches, and as you can imagine, this action didn't go unnoticed by the British. However, their initial response to this wasn't what you might expect. Now, when the British soldiers saw the Germans putting up these small little Christmas trees, they initially only saw the light from the trees because the British trenches were so far away from the German trenches. They couldn't see the trees that these lanterns emitting the light were tied to. So from the British perspective, all they saw were a bunch of lights beginning to come up along the German trenches. So the British soldiers took this as a sign that an attack was imminent. So the British soldiers began prepping themselves to get ready to defend themselves against the German attack. And then, while they were waiting for this attack to come, a strange sound began to drift through no man's land. A sound that none of the British soldiers expected to hear. Now, I would show you more of that clip, but I don't want to get copyright strikes. And to be honest with you, they may try to copyright me for showing you that little clip anyway, but whatever, I'll deal with it if it happens. But as you gathered from that clip, what the British soldiers heard the Germans doing was singing Silent Night. More specifically, they heard them singing the original Austrian version of Silent Night. The British soldiers began to sing with the Germans, and before you know it, the voices of both British and German soldiers alike began echoing across no man's land, both sides singing Christmas songs. Once the singing was over, soldiers actually began to move into no man's land to try to communicate with the other side to see if they could arrange a temporary ceasefire throughout the rest of Christmas Eve and into Christmas Day. This was done by regular soldiers and officers fighting on the front lines. Now remember, there were no orders from the higher-ups, like the generals and stuff, to do this. So by doing this, they were going against the orders of the higher-ups. But at this point, it was Christmas and both sides didn't really care. So they began working together to see if they could arrange this temporary ceasefire. And believe it or not, in most areas along the Western Front where this was happening, they were successful in organizing this temporary ceasefire. However, it didn't happen everywhere. There were a few areas along the Western Front where attempts to arrange this ceasefire were met by hostility. There was one area where soldiers were gunned down as they tried to cross no man's land to arrange this ceasefire. There was even one area where German soldiers began to sing Christmas carols, and they were met by British machine gun fire. However, this wasn't the case in most areas. In most areas, the ceasefire held, and the beginning of the Christmas Truce of 1914 had officially begun. And then, as dawn of Christmas morning came, soldiers on both sides began to venture out into no man's land and began to talk with each other on Christmas morning. They took the opportunity during this ceasefire to gather up and bury their dead, and then they even began talking and exchanging gifts with one another. Believe it or not, there was even a soccer game arranged at one section along the Western Front. But as Christmas Day came and went, the soldiers began to venture back into their respected trenches. And there was one point along the Western Front where the German and British officers met at the end of Christmas Day, saluted each other, and fired their guns up into the air to signal that the truce was over and the war was back on. At most areas along the Western Front where this Christmas Day ceasefire happened, there was an orderly end to it, so both sides knew when the war had officially started once again. Now, as you can imagine, the higher-ups definitely were not happy with their troops for engaging in this behavior on Christmas Day in 1914. They considered going after some people over it. However, so many people were involved in this on both sides that if they tried to go after anybody, they'd have to go after a lot of people, so they just decided to let it go. However, the higher-ups were determined to see that this would never happen again, and they even went so far as to court-martial anybody who suggested this in later years. But the thing is, the higher-ups shouldn't have even worried about it because, honestly, the only reason this Christmas Day ceasefire happened at all was because World War I was such a young war at this point. A lot of the horrible things that would happen later in the war hadn't happened yet. Remember, the Lusitania hadn't even been sunk yet in December of 1914. But as World War I continued to rage on over the following years, both sides would develop a bigger and bigger hate for each other, so there is no way a temporary Christmas Day ceasefire would happen again. This was a result of a very young war. But given that, I still think that this is a Christmas miracle because this does show that even in the darkest of times, even against enemies, both sides are human. Both sides are people. And wars are usually triggered by politics, not the soldiers down on the front lines. The soldiers are the ones just carrying out the orders of those in charge. And it's those in charge who are starting the wars in the first place. But down on the battlefield, everybody down there is just human. And at least this one time in December of 1914, the humanity in all of these soldiers came to light. And for this one day, these soldiers ventured out into no man's land and showed that we were all human. And that we all, if we put our minds to it, can get along with each other. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this Christmas special of Historic Travels. I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy Holiday. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good day, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in. Merry Christmas. Special thanks to our Captain Level Patreon supporters, Olivia Julius, Canadian, Greg Gallick, and Callum Whaley. Thank you all so much for all the support.